Spirit is what animates something, and the soul is the thing that's being animated. The soul is the vehicle of consciousness that's being brought to life so that we can have an individual perspective, an individual experience. During a spiritual awakening, we start to think deeper about what exactly is a soul. Does the soul even exist? What is the soul and what is spirit? Are they the same thing? And does everything have a soul? So today, I'm going to be explaining what the soul is and how it's different from spirit, as well as if everything has a soul. The word soul comes from Old German, and what it meant was body of water or a lake. And that's very appropriate when we're thinking of the soul, because the soul is a body of water. But water in this case would mean spirit. So the term soul comes from the sea. And when we're talking about sea and a body of water, we're talking now about consciousness itself. If you'd like to know what I mean about the sea being consciousness itself, you can watch my video, The Alchemy of Water, where I talk about how water in its highest form is ether. It's spirit, and it's known as the sea of consciousness. So a soul, an individual soul that is acting as a current within the sea, a body of water, water being a part of this sea, is going to be best understood as a vessel. The word soul comes from Old English, and in Old English it translated to sea or body of water. And then in Old German it even translated out into being a lake. So the soul is intimately connected with a sea and water and even a body of water. So when we're talking about these origins of how a soul is connected with water and the sea, what we're really pointing to is actually its spiritual body, its spiritual essence. Because what a soul is a current within the sea of consciousness. So imagine the current of water or the current within a sea, and how that one current is separate from another current, but it's still contained inside the sea. Well, this is exactly the relationship between the soul and the spirit, because the spirit is ultimately this sea of consciousness. That's what spirit is. To be more precise, if everything comes from consciousness, then the soul would be the body. It would be the vehicle or the current within the sea of consciousness. So it would be a body of spirit. And that's what the soul is. The soul is a vehicle that contains pneuma or spirit. So when we're talking about an individual experience that is separate from another individual experience, these individualistic experiences are all considered soul. In esoteric science, the soul has anywhere from 3 to 7 different bodies or aspects that it consists of. It has a sentient aspect that perceives an inner world. The sentient soul can take impressions that come from the outer world and turn them into meaning. The next aspect is the intellectual soul. The intellectual soul is meant to develop wisdom through reason, thought, and imagination. In some esoteric systems, there is a more divine aspect of the soul. This divine aspect of the soul is transcendent and eternal. This higher aspect of the soul exists in a state of compassion and freedom. When people are talking about the soul, they're usually referring to this divine aspect of it. Because of the different aspects that make up the soul, the best way to describe what exactly a soul is would be a locus of the sense of I. This locus of a sense of I holds the memory of everything it has experienced has mastered, still seeks to learn, and still seeks to balance, all stored inside its field. That's where the term old soul comes from. The more spiritually evolved the soul stream becomes, the more it manifests on higher planes of consciousness before it gets to the level of the oversoul. So the soul is the vehicle for spirit. And that's also why the soul is spelled S-O-L-E, soul, as in one, the soul. So when we're talking about how the soul is a vehicle for spirit, it goes down in extensions. It doesn't just go from spirit to soul. Instead, everything in existence goes in these fractal forms, or it goes down in layers and layers. It goes down in scale. So when something drops down in scale, it becomes more unique and it becomes more personal or more individuated. So the thing between the spirit or the sea of consciousness and the soul would be the oversoul. If you'd like to know more about the oversoul, you can watch my video, The Oversoul Explained. So things drop down in scale, and each time they drop down, now they start becoming more physical, or now they start becoming more individual. And that's why also the soul is known as the psyche, because what the psyche is the intersection between body and mind. So the mind and the body are also different ways of saying spirit and soul, because mind in Hermeticism is known as consciousness. And this sea of consciousness that we're talking about is ultimately spirit. So what is the difference between a soul and a spirit? Well, spirit is pneuma. That's what spirit means. It means pneuma and then different variations of that. But pneuma is the animating principle within all of existence. And so the animating principle is consciousness. Consciousness is what animates something. So to bring it to life, it needs spirit. And that's also why pneuma is known as breath. So the breath comes from spirit. And when we're talking about animating something, imagine blowing up a balloon with air. That's what I mean. You're bringing something to life. And what is life without breathing? When we stop breathing, we stop being alive. We stop being animated into this experience. And that's just a fractal. Everything you see here in the physical, if you take it as the whole story, that is very low consciousness, because we're all the symbol of what's happening at a metaphysical level. So when we breathe, the universe also is animated through breath. But that breath, once again, is known as pneuma, and it's known as spirit. So spirit is what animates something. And the soul is the thing that's being animated. The soul is the vehicle of consciousness that's being brought to life so that we can have an individual perspective, an individual experience. But once again, we're a part of this larger sea of consciousness. So that's why a current within the sea is the best way to describe what a soul is. It would be one of the currents that's going as an extension of the larger part, which is the sea. So the current is still the sea, but it's also an individual experience of the sea. And that's why, once again, the soul is known as psyche. The psyche is the intersection. It's the cross point between mind, aka spirit, aka consciousness, and body. So sometimes some traditions look at the soul as being that intersection point, as it being also spirit and also the physical, body and mind. And that's the perfect example of why the word psyche is the word psyche, because the word psyche doesn't mean the brain. The word psyche, we typically think of means the mind. But the psyche's more than just the mind. The psyche is when the physical body, the soul, and then the spirit are all a complex together, known in this age as body, mind, spirit complex. So in the New Age, we know this term of psyche or soul, sometimes expressed as a complex. And like I said, the body, mind, spirit complex. Do you see how the body, mind, spirit complex is just another way of saying that there's these different bodies, and that when they're intersected and connected together, they're creating a personal, individual soul. So at that point, we're seeing soul now as being this complex. And I would say that's the best way to describe the soul. The soul is a complex. This is also why the Buddha said there was no soul. It's because the Buddha was tuning in to the fact that what we're calling a soul or an individual experience is actually a complex. But instead of viewing the soul as the body, mind, spirit complex, the Buddha saw this thing that we were perceiving as a soul as being a complex called the Five Aggregates. So the Buddha saw the soul just as this complex called aggregates. And what is an aggregate? An aggregate is a collective. What is the sea of consciousness? It's a collective. So aggregates in this case, as the five aggregates that Buddha's referring to: formation, perception, sensory consciousness, these different things that we would attribute to having a unique essence called the soul. The Buddha saw as being not even belonging to a specific individual being called soul, called body-mind. Instead, the Buddha saw that what we were calling a soul, or what the New Age can call the body-mind-spirit complex, was in fact an individual experience that was created out of some sort of karmic complex, some sort of Venus flytrap, really. This sort of attachment to these sensory sea of consciousness. So the Buddha saw the five aggregates, when they get too enmeshed, when they become too personalized, too identified with, as actually forming whatever we're calling the soul, which is why the soul still exists. It's just that if we're looking at it from the Buddhist perspective, the soul is something that is a complex that we would actually need to awaken out of so that we can commune with our true nature, which he would have considered emptiness. And that's where his teaching of there being no self comes from. It comes from the ultimate truth, which is that emptiness, or what I'm calling a sea of consciousness, or even beyond that, the no-thingness that is breath, is the real truth. It is this ultimate emptiness that is animating and pervading all shapes or all forms. And when they come into a form and they intersect, that is called a soul. Here's where there can be a little confusion. In both alchemy and in Hermetic tradition, the term mind means spirit. The Hermetic principle, all is mind, really means all is spirit. But the soul or psyche is also known as mind. So the confusion can come from trying to understand, why does mind mean both soul and spirit? That is because in alchemy, the soul and the spirit trade places. The soul is the one known as the sea of consciousness, and the spirit is known as the medium for that consciousness, which structures the soul or structures the sea of consciousness into a physical form through thought. In this system, it would go consciousness structures itself into a thought, aka spirit, and thought then materializes itself into form. So it would go soul to spirit to body. In alchemy, everything is created from this trinity of soul, spirit, and body, but in varying degrees. However, in most esoteric systems, the spirit is God consciousness and the soul is self-consciousness. The spirit is the macrocosm and the soul is the microcosm. The soul is the reflection of the above. The soul is our God spark. It is the stream of consciousness rather than consciousness itself. If anything, we have just learned how all-pervading mind is. It cannot be pinned down by one aspect, one attribute, or even one domain. So, there is such a thing as a soul. It's just explained differently, perceived differently, and it is known differently depending on what tradition or what spiritual system that we're talking about it and learning about it through. In alchemy, the soul is not only real, it is actually where the great work is meant to happen. So the soul is also known in alchemy as being the perfected state of the elements. So water, fire, air, earth, and ether are those alchemical elements. Ether is known as the quintessence, and it's also known as spirit. So watch my video on the alchemy of water if you really want to understand spirit as being water. But ether, spirit, breaks itself into the different elements. And when it becomes an individual element, such as fire or water or earth or air, now it goes through the process of the great work. Now it goes through the process of recombining itself, purifying itself, and it becomes more integrated and more coherent, more unified each time that it gets purified in the realm of spirit. So in alchemy, the soul and the spirit are meant to be not only in union, but the spirit is meant to help liberate the soul. So when we're talking about the soul specifically with alchemy, what we're talking about is the soul is not just the thing that's being worked on to reach enlightenment. It's also being rectified. Rectification is a huge theme in alchemy, which simply in this case means that the soul is being redeemed. It's being purified. It's being awakened so that it can come into enlightenment, because when the soul is in enlightenment, now the soul is united with spirit. It's no longer separate from spirit. It is now the awakened, the enlightened, the liberated body of spirit, rather than being trapped in the ego consciousness, in the Venus flypaper of the aggregates. So you see how in this case that I'm just creating right now, Buddha's whole teaching of there being no self is not at all in conflict with alchemy. They're actually in harmony because I said so. In some traditions of mysticism, the soul is immortal. And in other traditions of mysticism, the soul is mortal. Not only is it mortal, you are lucky if you have one. And this is where esotericism and mysticism are no chill, because we usually think of the soul as a given. We take for granted that the soul is immortal. But in reality, and especially in fourth way teachings, where I come from, you have to earn a soul. And what I mean by that is you might be a current of this greater sea of consciousness. So you might have a vehicle of spirit. But what is the quality of this vessel? What is the quality of this vehicle, of this body of spirit? And in many threads of mysticism, this quality that we call a soul is something that is not a given and that we have to continue to develop over lifetimes, because it either grows and evolves and develops into ultimately its next octave or its next density, or it regresses, it de-evolves, and it ends up becoming entropic in nature, when I'm talking about entropy in this specific scenario. I'm talking about how the quality of the soul can just continue to devolve until all of its spirit that is contained within it just disperses. It just chaotically disperses. And eventually when that happens and you just keep dispersing that spiritual energy for so long, it ends up in what's known in mysticism as second death. But there's a long road between that and second death, and it's ugly. So these teachings about the soul being on a trajectory to develop and evolve, or to devolve and disperse itself, is also known in Hermeticism. It's known in Hermeticism as teachings that have to do with karma, meaning that even if we ourselves don't believe in another life, or we ourselves don't believe in evolution, that nature will still have to compensate for our individual soul. Nature will still have to go through a recycling process where it's balancing, aka the entropy is dispersing it, transforming it back into sheer creative energy for the universe to use. So that whole process of it dispersing the soul is where we start thinking of soul loss, is where we start thinking of soulless, right? Because things aren't really soulless. You could just have more soul or less soul. And I know that sometimes in the spiritual community, we get too spiritual to function, that we don't want to acknowledge the fact that there are such a thing as having more soul or more development, or less soul or less development. But there is such a thing. And that's why it's so important when you have to look at things like, oh, is that selling your soul or not? Why? Because we have free will. And with that, what we're doing is actually using our free will to either evolve or to devolve. And that's a longer process, but I'm summing it up between evolving or devolving. And what all of that evolving or devolving is actually doing is it's having the soul either evolve, grow, cultivate, develop more, or it's having it degrade. So as we can see, the soul is an interesting character because it can either be unified, and when it's in this unified and coherent way, it's coming into enlightenment, where it is spirit, but now it's spirit in an awakened vessel. And that is what I would consider the best term for soul. It would be vessel, a vessel of spirit. And what we have is the soul being the vessel of spirit, spirit meaning pneuma, meaning breath. It could also be looked at in Eastern traditions as Shakti, but having pneuma, breath, prana, be the animating life force. It is what gives animation. It is what gives life. It gives breath into a particular being, is the dynamism within creation. It is the creative process between existence, which is spirit, and experiencer, which is soul. I hope this has helped you merge your soul and spirit. Make sure to subscribe to my channel for higher dimensional guidance through spiritual awakening. See you next time.